Hi ladies, this is part 2 of what we watched yesterday. It ain't as long as yesterday's, darlings. You know what I mean? Enjoy!
School Ghost. Chris is currently a police officer in the United Kingdom, but in his previous job, he worked for a private security firm and would occasionally be called out to alarm responses at various locations on the outskirts of London. Most of the call-outs were either hoaxes or due to animals or bugs moving in front of a motion sensor. However, on one particular night, Chris was told by his control room that there was a motion sensor alarm activation at a Hare Krishna primary school. It was a fairly routine call for Chris, except that he hadn't been there before. Chris arrived at roughly 2 a.m. It was pitch black and pouring with rain. The school itself was huge, with around 20 classrooms which circled a central courtyard with a large shrine in the center. Once Chris entered the property and silenced the alarm, he turned the building lights on. When he checked the alarm panel, it showed multiple motion sensor activations, as if someone had been walking around the building. Chris walked through the school and noticed that all the interior doors were wide open. He proceeded to check each room and office, and noticed that there were no footprints or animal prints, which was odd as it had been raining all night and the building was surrounded by muddy fields, and he himself was leaving a trail with his muddy boots. After checking the whole building, he confirmed no one was there and nothing had been disturbed, so he just assumed the school staff had left the interior doors open and something benign had triggered the alarm. Chris reset the alarms and left the premises after making sure all the lights were off, all the doors were closed, and all exterior points of entry were locked and secured. Then at around 3:30 a.m, Chris got another call from the control room saying you'll never guess what. Chris instantly knew it was the school again. As he left to deal with the call out, his colleague called and said he would come to the school as he was used to figuring out faults with alarm panels and resetting them. The pair arrived at 4 a.m. It was still dark and pouring with rain. The first thing Chris noticed was that all the lights had been turned on again. Chris and his colleague entered the building and silenced the alarm, and once again it was showing multiple motion sensor activations. Looking down the corridor, Chris noticed that all of the interior doors which had previously closed were now open again. Thinking that someone was playing a prank, they decided to look through the CCTV footage. The system was motion activated, so it would only have recorded when motion was detected. As they looked through the footage, Chris could see himself recorded on the previous call-out, showing him moving through the property, securing it and leaving. After a few minutes, the recording stopped. The next recording showed all of the doors open with all the lights on. Chris and his colleagues were shocked, but they had a job to do and moved through the school and secured it. This time, not just by closing, but locking the interior doors. But as they walked through the building, they got a strange feeling as if they were not welcome and that something was watching them. It's worth pointing out that Chris and his colleague were used to checking out creepy abandoned buildings with no problem, but this place felt ominous. The two men did their job and left. A few days later, Chris was speaking with an older man who had been with the company for years and was about to tell him what happened at the school. But as soon as he mentioned the school name, the guy said, "Have you seen the ghost too?" He explained that years ago, when he went there for an alarm call, he saw a black shadow the size of a man floating down one of the corridors. He was so scared that he refused to ever go back there. Comfort after tragedy. This next photograph was sent in by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll call him X. X and his family suffered a devastating accident in 2021, which resulted in the deaths of both his parents, along with 3 other people. For X's grandmother, it was almost unbearable, as it was the second child she had lost. To help her take her mind off the tragic events, X convinced his grandmother to go with his aunt and her family on a camping trip. During the trip, X's auntie took a picture of his grandmother, sitting in a chair eating. However, when they later looked at the photo, they noticed something strange in the background. To the family, it looks like a couple with arms around each other's shoulders, sitting behind grandma. And the only explanation they can think of is that it's the spirit of X's parents. Now, we have seen this before after a loved one has died, and it often brings comfort to the bereaved families to think their relatives are still looking out for them after they've passed. And we hope that for X and his family, this is the case. Our heart goes out to them. Teshia. Teshia is a subscriber and Patreon, and she sent this next photo to us of her dog in a fancy dress. It's easy to get distracted by how cute the dog is, but if you look in the background, there is something strange going on. Teshia has no idea what that is, as there was nothing on the chair at the time, and finds it hard to believe it could be a glitch in the camera, because it was taken with a brand new Note 20 phone. When Teshia zoomed in on the anomaly, she was even more shocked, as there is a definite face-like image. The photo was taken in Teshia's apartment in Portland, Oregon. The block is super old, and ever since they moved in about a year ago, strange things have happened there. They regularly hear knocks on the closet doors, and numerous other unexplained noises in the living room. Also, the dog barks and acts aggressively at nothing, which is very out of character for her. However, perhaps the creepiest thing happened when Teshia's dad stayed over and slept on the living room couch. The next day, he told her that he saw a woman in the reflection of the TV. She was standing behind him, holding up 5 fingers. Could that same mystery woman have something to do with the anomaly in the photograph? We'd love to hear your thoughts. We stay in the UK. This next spooky story was sent in by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll call him N. In 2016, N and his family visited the UK from the Middle East to get some passport issues sorted out. Whilst in the UK, they lived in a small house built in the garden of one of their relatives. The house was open plan with 1 big bed, 2 sofas, a makeshift kitchen, and 1 bathroom. N never liked being in the house, as it always felt tense, as if there was a presence watching him. A lot of strange things happened whilst they stayed in the house, but one stood out in particular. It was around 10 PM, and the family were getting ready to go to bed. Because the place was so small, N and his brother slept on the floor and on the sofas. By around 11:30, everyone was asleep, except N. He couldn't sleep, as something didn't feel right. He tried falling asleep multiple times, but it was no use. After about 20 minutes, N turned his head towards the makeshift kitchen area, and there in a gap between 2 of the cupboards was a person who appeared to be glowing white. It was crouched down with its knees tucked into its chest and was rocking slowly back and forth. N rubbed his eyes in disbelief, thinking he was imagining something, but when he looked again it was still there. At this point he felt a wave of nausea, and suddenly the figure moved and started staring right at him, and its eyes turned from white to red. N was so scared he was shaking and hid under the covers, hoping that whatever it was would go away. As he hid, his mother woke up and started praying very loudly and crying. This woke up N's brothers, and they all got up to see what was going on. When N finally came out from under the blanket, the white figure was gone, but his mother was still shaken with fear and could barely talk. She later put it down to a terrifying nightmare. After the incident, N's grandmother came to stay, and she too experienced a similar terrifying nightmare and a force on her that she had never felt before. N thinks he may have an explanation to why these things happen in the house. Before the small house was built, there was an old shed on the site. It had long been neglected and was hardly used, but strange sounds were often heard coming from inside the shed, and it had the reputation of being haunted. The shed was demolished to make way for the house, and in doing so disturbed whatever was lingering inside the shed. N believes it could be those disgruntled spirits that are responsible for what he and other members of his family have experienced when staying in the house. Who's that creepy face in the window? This next image was sent in by Jen from Pennsylvania. A few years ago, Jen and her friends were hanging out at her house, and Jen's mother took a photograph of them. At the time, they didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. Then about a year later, one of Jen's friends was looking at the photo and noticed something peering through the window. Take a look. Jen has told us that there is no way someone could have been standing looking through the window from outside, as it's too far off the ground and she has no idea whose face it is. Understandably, realizing that somebody might be spying on her has completely freaked Jen out. She has always felt something odd about the house, and has often heard people walking up the stairs when there is no one there, and just a general eerie feeling about the place. It's worth noting that the house is located in the coal region of Pennsylvania and is close to where an old coal breaker used to be. The area is well known as a place where Molly Maguires were active. The Molly Maguires were an Irish 19th century secret society known for their activism among Irish American and Irish immigrant coal miners in Pennsylvania, and after a series of violent conflicts, 20 suspected members of the Molly Maguires were convicted of murder and other crimes and were executed by hanging in the late 1800s. Could it be that members of the Molly Maguires still linger in spirit form, and that is who is peering through the window? The Greenbrier Ghost. In October 1896, Alva Zonahista, who was known as Zona, married her sweetheart, Erasmus Striving Trout Shoe, in Greenbrier, West Virginia, after just a few short months of meeting. Shoe worked as a blacksmith and was new to the area. This led to opposition to the marriage from Zona's mother, Mary Jane. She didn't want Zona, who was in her early 20s, to marry the much older stranger. And for other unknown reasons, she just didn't like him. In January of 1897, Zona had been a bride for just 3 months when her body was found at the bottom of the stairs by an 11-year-old boy named Andy Jones. He had been sent to the house by Shoe and told to ask Zona if she needed anything from the general store. Young Andy ran straight home to tell his mother what he had seen, before continuing on to the blacksmith shop to inform Shoe. Shoe, who appeared to be in great distress, ran home and summoned the local coroner, Dr. W. Knapp. When he arrived, he found that Shoe had carried his wife upstairs. He had stripped and redressed her in her Sunday best, a dress with a high collar and large bow. Zona's face was covered by a veil. Knapp tried to determine the cause of death, but was hindered by Shoe, who remained by his wife's head, embracing her upper body and weeping uncontrollably. So after a cursory examination, Knapp announced that Zona had died from an everlasting faint, now known as a heart attack. Zona's body was laid out for burial. Neighbours who came to the wake noticed that Shoe was acting very strangely. He had tied a large scarf around Zona's neck, claiming that it had been her favourite, and he wouldn't let anyone near her body. She was taken to her mother's home on Big Sewell Mountain, and buried on the hilltop there in a small cemetery. About a month later, for 4 consecutive nights, Zona's ghost appeared to her mother. She said Shoe was abusive, and he had broken her neck in a fit of rage because she had not cooked any meat for supper. The ghost turned her head completely around to demonstrate the damage to her neck. Mary Jane demanded an immediate investigation because of Shoe's strange behaviour and the untimely circumstances of Zona's death. Prosecutor John Preston agreed to have her body exhumed. The autopsy discovered that Zona had a broken neck. There were finger marks on her throat and the windpipe had been crushed. Shoe was arrested and charged with murder, and before his trial, investigations found that he had already served time in a penitentiary for horse theft and had previously been married twice. Both wives had died under suspicious circumstances. One was supposed to have fallen from a haystack and broken her neck. The other had a basket of rocks dropped on her head when Shoe was on the roof repairing a chimney. Although Shoe protested his innocence, he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment due to the evidence being purely circumstantial. The people of Greenbrier, unhappy with his sentence, formed a lynching party but failed in their attempt to hang Shoe. He was taken to the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville and died there in March of 1900, aged 38. At trial, Mary Jane's testimony concerning the appearance of her daughter's apparition was entered into the record. The Greenbrier ghost is the only known case in the US in which a ghost's testimony helped to convict a murderer. The Mann family. During the autumn of 1991, Alan Mann was 19 years old. He lived with his parents in Lake Wales, Florida. One day he returned home from work after the night shift. He was asleep during the afternoon, but was awoken at 3 p.m. to find a woman standing in the doorway of his room. She turned towards the hallway as though she was leaving. Alan got up and walked over to the door. but by the time he got there, the figure had disappeared. He said he looked all over the house for the woman, but could not find her, and all of the doors of the house were locked from the inside. Alan told his mother, Sandra, that he thought that he might have seen a ghost, but she dismissed the idea. Alan eventually married a girl named Linda, and she moved into the Mann family house. One evening, Sandra was sitting on the couch watching TV with her daughter-in-law when she saw the ghost herself. Sandra noticed a white, smoke-like form appear at the end of the couch. Her dog, Princess, who was sitting beside her, also noticed it too, but by the time the dog had jumped down, the apparition had disappeared. Although Linda had not seen anything strange, she was positive that the house was haunted. She enlisted the help of a friend who owned an Ouija board, and together with Alan, they performed a seance. They were awarded the name Kramer, although no one knew anyone by that name. Alan's father David was startled by a strange smell in the middle of the hallway and believed that a little voice inside his head spoke to him, saying, "This is Isabella." On one occasion, Alan said that Linda violently attacked him. It was incredibly uncalled for, and she just snapped. Normally, Linda had a high-pitched giggle, but she started laughing in an evil way. Alan tried to push her away, but it only made Linda more vicious. Alan had to physically slam her against the wall before she would let go of him. Then Linda just gently placed her head on his shoulder and carried on the conversation exactly where she had left off before she had snapped. Afterwards, Linda could not remember what had happened and was upset when Alan told her what she had done. Now recognizing the seriousness of the situation, David went to see a spiritualist. He was told to pour salt all around the house, keep bags of it under their beds, and try an exorcism. But none of this worked. Everyone in the family was suffering from violent headaches, and they began to hear many voices, all muttering together. One voice was that of a woman, and it was louder than the rest, but they could not distinguish what any of the voices were saying. A local medium visited the home, and was able to name the ghost that lived there as Isabella Kramer. It was a familiar name to the Manns, as they had been aware of it for several weeks. A minister visited the family, and afterwards the phenomena appeared to settle down. Regardless, Sandra and David decided to move. But while they were packing, Linda began to shout and swear angrily at the ghost, causing a light bulb to explode and catch fire. The Center for Paranormal Studies from Silver Springs began an investigation into the activity. One of the 3 team members, Andrew Nichols, described the house as having an extremely oppressive atmosphere. The team soon began to experience headaches, and Nichols said that the old bedroom of Alan and Linda had the most amount of activity. Polaroid photographs were taken, and one showed a vague human shape. Sandra believes that the shape in the photo was Isabella. The image was examined in 1993 at Polaroid headquarters, and it was determined that the shape seen was not due to a defect in the camera or the film. The Black Hope Curse. During the early 1980s, Houston, Texas experienced a huge redevelopment program. There were new citizens arriving at the area who wanted to be close to the hustle and bustle of a lively city, but also wanted to live in a quiet, safe area. So housing subdivisions were constructed in the outlying areas. One of these was built just outside of Houston in Crosby and called the Newport Subdivision. It was an appealing and upmarket development. The brand new homes were stunning, with well-mown lawns, and you would think that it was the picture-perfect place for families to live out their American dream. Sam and Judith Hanley believed just that. So when they moved into the western perimeter of the development in 1982, they thought that it was their dream house, the home that they had always been looking for, and at first they were very happy there. The Haynes decided to put a swimming pool in the backyard, and the construction crew arrived to make preparations. It was then that a strange elderly gentleman turned up on their doorstep. He introduced himself as Jasper Norton, and he said the Haynes needed to know something about the backyard before they put in the pool. Sam followed Mr. Norton around the house, and the old man pointed to an area on the ground and said there were graves there. He showed Sam the exact spot where they were, and advised him not to go through with the plan. Sam wasn't sure what to say. He didn't know whether the man was joking around, but was unsure as to why anyone would find it funny. Norton then explained that he had buried the bodies himself when he was in his teens. He said that the area had once been a cemetery, and most of the interned there were former African American slaves, and it was called Black Hope Cemetery. He said the last burial there was in 1939, and there were at least 60 paupers' graves still there. To find out if this was true, Sam and Judith began to dig in the place that Mr. Norton had pointed out. It wasn't long before he hit something hard and made of wood. The couple had uncovered 2 coffins containing human remains. One of the skeletons had 2 wedding rings on the index finger. Judith Haynes was horrified that they had desecrated someone's grave. Sam called in the sheriff, and the county coroner performed an official exhumation. With the help of Mr. Norton and some research into local records, the skeletons were found to belong to 2 former freed slaves who had died in the 1930s. They were called Charles and Betty Thomas. The decision was made to rebury the bodies and let them rest in peace. And that is when the paranormal phenomena began, not just for the Haynes, but for dozens of other families in Newport. It began when Judith noticed that her bedside clock had started to spark and glow even though it was unplugged. On another night, Judith was alone in the house when she heard the sliding door open and a voice ask, "What are you doing?" On inspection, she found the door was locked. In the morning, she was unable to find her shoes, and they'd reappear on top of the graves in the backyard. Ben and Jean Williams were the Haynes' neighbor. They noticed that their garden flowers kept dying, and coffin-shaped sinkholes began to appear in the garden. It didn't matter how many times they were filled in, they would suddenly reappear. The house was plagued with cold spots, whispering voices, shadowy figures, and had a general air of dread throughout. Ben actually saw 2 ghosts in the house one night. He watched them walk down the hallway and to the bedroom. He even passed through one of them in an attempt to protect his wife. Both families sought legal action against the developers for failure to disclose that their houses were built on a graveyard. The Williamses moved back to Montana after their daughter was struck down by a mysterious illness and died. The Haynes had to move away after declaring bankruptcy. The judge ruled that the developer was blameless. Many families in Newport have suffered with poltergeist activity and have seen strange apparitions, yet others have never experienced anything strange. Perhaps one thing is clear: it's probably a good idea to move and re-enter any bodies from grave sites before you start building on the land. Big Moose Lake. Grace May Brown was just 20 years old and worked at a textile factory in Cortland, New York, when she met Chester Gillette. The Gillette skirt factory where Grace worked was owned by Chester's uncle. Chester was well known in the area as a womanizer who considered himself a big shot because he came from a wealthy family. Grace was just a factory girl. Nevertheless, she caught Chester's eye. He was rich, handsome, and heir to the Gillette fortune, so Grace was quite easily swept off her feet. Chester refused to take Grace out in public, but she was so happily in love that she didn't care, and in 1906 she became pregnant with Chester's child. He arranged a romantic break to the Adirondack Mountains. They stayed at the Glenmore Hotel on Big Moose Lake on the way there. Chester rented a canoe for a romantic ride out onto the lake. There he hit Grace over the head with a tennis racket and left her to drown when she fell into the water. He fled the scene but was later caught, tried for her murder, and sent to the electric chair. It could be that Grace never left Big Moose Lake though. It is said that she has been seen many times since her murder. Further up the lake, at Covewood Lodge, a misty white apparition is often seen around the property. Sometimes a figure is seen falling through the water before vanishing into the murky depths. Other times just a face is seen creepily floating beneath the surface. Wherever the presence is felt, at Big Moose Lake, there appears to be a veil of overwhelming misery and hopelessness that has left some witnesses with a breathless feeling of abject terror. The Tallman family. In April of 1986, Deborah and Alan Tallman moved to the small farming town in Hirocon in Wisconsin. The church-going family had 3 children and were looking forward to living in their dream home on Larrabee Street. In February of 1987, they bought a used bunk bed from a second-hand store. The bunk beds were assembled and then stored away in the basement. The beds had been purchased for the 2 young daughters, and in May they were moved upstairs. The older boy, Danny, was to sleep next door in the smaller room. That night, Debbie tucked him in and left the clock radio on for him as he fell asleep. Danny got up and told Debbie that the station had changed. Debbie got him back to bed and reset the station, but he quickly got up again and was frightened, saying that the station had changed once again and that he had saw the dial move by itself. It later got to the point where Danny would throw a tantrum at bedtime because he was so afraid to sleep in his room. The Tallmans turned to their pastor for help, and he visited the home, saying that he felt evil in the house and believed that there was a demonic presence. He thought that regularly attending church might help the family. The Tallmans were being terrorized. Doors would slam shut on their own, visitors would see red eyes staring at them, and disembodied voices could be heard all around the house. Just before Christmas, Danny was petrified after seeing another vision. Alan was angry and dared the entity to fight with him instead of frightening little children. 3 weeks later, he returned home at 2 a.m. from a late shift at work. When he got out of the car, he could hear a strange howling noise that was growing louder and louder. He heard a voice call to him from out of the howling. Alan walked around the back of the house to see who was there, but finding no one, he returned to the car and found the garage on fire. Scared, he ran inside to call the fire service, dropping his lunchbox on the way. After going back outside, he saw that the fire had gone out and there was no sign of any damage. It was as though it never happened. Alan went back inside where he locked the door behind him, only to have his lunchbox ripped out of his hand when he reached down for it. It was thrown across the room by some unseen force. Because the children were so scared, Alan began to sleep on the floor of his daughter's bedroom. He was awoken one night to find the room engulfed in a strange mist and a voice threatening him, saying, "You're dead." Alan was so afraid that Debbie had to call the pastor. He arrived to find Alan with pale skin and blue lips, and he was shaking with fear. In January of 1988, a teenage relative stayed over to help Debbie and the children whilst Alan was at work. Whilst he was helping to get the children ready for bed, he began screaming for Debbie. He and the children were hysterical because they'd all seen an apparition in the bedroom. It was the final straw. They got the kids and fled the house for good. 2 weeks later, the Tallmans had the bunk beds destroyed. They moved to another city where they never experienced any other paranormal activity. A new family moved into the house on Larrabee Street, and they too never experienced any strange phenomena. Scratched by an unseen force. This disturbing story was sent in by Janka from Slovakia. About 5 years ago, when Janka was 20 years old, she was not in a good place. She hated school, had health issues, and was struggling with depression. One summer's evening, Janka was home alone in her parents' apartment as they were away on vacation, and she decided to take a shower. At this point, everything seemed normal. But as she turned on the water and started washing her hair, she felt a sharp pain in her arm. Janka opened her eyes and noticed that the ceiling light was blinking fast. At this point, she felt quite scared and nauseous. Then a horrible feeling of dread came over her, like someone was about to do something bad to her. Janka ran out of the bathroom, through the hallway to her bedroom, leaving water all over the floor. As she climbed onto her bed, the light in the bathroom stopped blinking, and the light in her room started blinking uncontrollably. Something had clearly followed her. Janka went into full panic mode and kept repeating, "Wherever you are, please go away. Please leave." After a couple of seconds, which she said felt like an eternity, all the activity stopped. The light went back to normal, and the heavy, awful feeling of despair and fear left her. It was like her reality shifted from nightmare mode back to normal. As Janka collected herself, she noticed something on her arm, a small scratch in the shape of a hook. The shape was strange, not like a regular scratch from a scrape or a cat. Janka has drawn us a recreation of the strange mark. Things got even weirder when the next day she woke up and the scratch was gone. Not a trace of it was visible. The skin had just gone back to normal. Janka shared her experience with friends, and one of them advised her to sprinkle salt in the corners of all rooms. So she did, and it seemed to work, as apart from the one terrifying incident, nothing weird has happened since. Janka has asked us to share her experience in the hope that someone may have had a similar experience, or has knowledge of what it was, as 5 years later she is still shaken from the incident, and would like some closure or explanation as to what happened that day. The eerie face in the limpet. Now this is an odd one. It was sent to us by Eloy. A few years ago, Eloy's mother retired and sold her home and business, and moved to a condo in Toronto, Canada. She loved music, especially Portuguese folk and pop music, and over the years she collected several albums and singles on vinyl. When she was going through her belongings prior to the move, she gave Eloy her entire vinyl collection. He took all the boxes and put them away in his house, and figured he'd look through the collection at some point in the future. A few years later, Eloy was planning a major renovation at his house and had to move a lot of stuff around. That's when he came across the boxes with his mum's vinyl collection. He decided to take a look through the collection, and as well as finding some gems from Elvis and the Beatles, he came across something unusual. It was a single with a cover picture that looked like an oyster shell with a strange face in the center. Eloy called his mum to see if she knew the story behind it. She told him that the Conjunto de Francisco Jovia were a musical group founded in Toronto, Canada, who immigrated from the Portuguese Azores. Their leader wrote a song called O Misterio de Lapa, or The Mystery of the Limpet, after seeing it in person. The cover picture was not an oyster shell, but rather a limpet shell. Limpets are a popular food in the Portuguese islands. The shell with the face in was found on the island of São Miguel in the late 70s. At the time, its discovery was well publicized, with many believing the image was that of Jesus Christ. The shell was even displayed at the annual feast of Senhor Santo Cristo dos Milagres, or Lord Holy Christ of the Miracles, and Francisco Gouveia apparently attended the festival and was so inspired to write a song about what he saw. In the song, Francisco sings about his feelings towards the face in the limpet, but doesn't provide any insight beyond that. However, Eloy's mum told him who she believes is the face of the limpet. Back in the day, São Miguel was a very religious and superstitious society. She should know, as she was born and raised there until she immigrated to Canada. It was at the time when homosexuality was frowned upon, and most gay men would live their lives in the closet, and many would even get married and have children to comply with societal norms. Such was the case for one man who was having trouble with his marriage, and the fact he was living a lie. Legend states that this particular man was at the end of his tether and decided to take his own life, so he went to one of the main rocky cliffs on the edge of the ocean on the island, stripped off his clothes and folded them neatly on a rock and jumped to his death. After his wife noticed he was missing, the only thing that was found were his clothes, and it's believed that he is the mysterious figure in the limpet. Lingering roadside ghost. This next image was sent in by Anthony and was taken on August 26, 2021 in Fairfax, Virginia, a metropolitan suburb of Washington, D.C. in the United States. Anthony captured the image as he drove home from work. He always passed an abandoned house and one day stopped to take some photographs of it. At first, he didn't notice anything remarkable about the shots he took, but when he looked again at them 3 days later, he noticed a white translucent figure in one of the photos. After doing some research, Anthony discovered the house dates back to the late 19th century, and on the right side of the front door are letters and numbers that read 5400 Goolsby Way. Originally, there was a general store next to it called Balvin's Grocery. Anthony also contacted a Facebook group called Abandoned in Virginia, and a group member informed him that his grandfather owned the house and the store next to it, and his grandma was born in the house in 1924. And his family had found a 1931 newspaper article in the walls of the house, although he had no information on any hauntings. Could it be that the former owners of the house from nearly 100 years ago still linger around the property in spirit form? What do you think? Living with the spirit of Mrs Hammond. Julie and her husband moved into a large old pre-Second World War house on Anzac Day in 1981. It had been empty for 10 years and had nothing done to it since it was first built, and still had all the beautiful original fittings and features. However, the house felt creepy and neglected, with peeling paint and an atmosphere that felt like death. A few nights after they moved in, it was a warm night, and the couple were finding it hard to sleep, not helped by the cat sleeping on Julie's chest. At around midnight, there was an almighty bang, like someone was throwing heavy furniture in their living room, located just off the main bedroom. They ran out expecting to see burglars or something, but there was nothing. In the panic, the cat had scratched Julie's eye, and she had blood pouring down her face, which only added to the terror. Looking down, they noticed that the cat was now arching and spitting at something in the corner of the room, and her gaze was fixed on something they could not see. She growled and hissed like they'd never seen before. After a full search of the house, they found nothing, so shrugged it off, did the necessary first aid, and went back to bed. A week or so later, Julie was home alone doing some cooking when something walked up behind her, casting a shadow on the white kitchen cupboards. The shadow was moving, but Julie was not. She looked around, expecting to see her husband home from work, but there was no one there. Julie checked outside, thinking that someone was near the window, but there was nothing. Over the course of the next few weeks, this happened often and was becoming a regular occurrence, although Julie's husband did not believe her and thought she was losing the plot. However, strange things continued to happen, from appliances unplugging themselves, things going missing, shadows, and also balls of stale perfume moving around the house. They knew it was the perfume worn by the old lady that used to own the house, as her belongings were left in the back bedroom, along with their old perfume bottles. Even after the room was renovated, walls painted, carpet and curtains replaced, the smell still roamed the house. The couple had 2 children, a boy and a girl, while one night their daughter came out crying, saying she wanted her dolls taken out as one of them kept on waving at her. Julie knew exactly what was causing it: Mrs Hammond, the previous owner. Julie had done some research with the neighbours to find out more about her and her life, as she was now a very firm believer in the afterlife and wanted to know more about her. Perhaps the scariest incident was when the family was sitting in their living room one night. The dishes were done and everything was cleaned, and the kitchen and dining room lights were off. When Julie noticed the glow of the kitchen light, she got up and turned it off and went back to watch TV again. A few minutes later, the light was on again. Thinking it was one of the kids, she checked on them, but both were sound asleep. Turning the light off again, Julie returned to the lounge. It happened again, so she turned the light off and stood there, in front of it, to see what was happening. It switched itself on again, right in front of her eyes. Julie freaked out completely, wanting to bundle the kids up and never come back. The house had been fully rewired by an electrical engineer a few years earlier, so she rang him, telling him what was happening. He had no explanation and said it's not possible. After that, things settled down with no occurrences at all. Julie now feels bad about how she reacted, thinking she had scared Mrs Hammond out of her own house. However, just a few years later, Julie saw an actual apparition. It was the top half of an old lady walking in to what used to be her bedroom. Strangely, Julie felt no fear, just relief that she was still there. Dudley Castle Drummer Boy. In August 2021, Ryan and Natalie went on a family day trip to Dudley Zoo and Castle in the West Midlands, UK. It was an enjoyable day walking around the zoo, but the real draw was visiting the castle grounds, as Ryan and Natalie are both avid believers in all aspects of the paranormal, and the castle is reputed to be haunted by a grey lady. After entering the castle grounds, the couple started to take the obligatory family tourist snaps, but they also took other random snaps in the hopes of capturing something. When the couple got home and looked through their photos, it wasn't the lady in grey they captured, it was the less well-known ghost of the drummer boy. Take a look. They believe they captured a full-body apparition of the drummer boy ghost, standing in the courtyard outside a doorway. This is a lesser-known ghost of the castle, but there are a few stories of him. Natalie has ancestral links to the castle, as her 13th and 14th great-grandfathers both owned it. So perhaps with the family link, the boy appeared. Natalie and Ryan were part of a large group of 10 people, and none of the group remembers anyone coming out of the doorway after them, and all the children with them were accounted for and stood by them. Since Ryan sent us the photo, the sighting has caught the attention of the local newspaper, and although some have dismissed it as either a black metal cutout, part of the fence, or even a small child, you can see from this photo there is nothing like that where the apparition was captured. It's not the first time the drummer boy has been spotted at Dudley Castle. He is thought to be one of 3 ghosts that haunt the building, with the Grey Lady, believed to be the spirit of Dorothy Beaumont, being the most famous, followed by the ghost of Lord Somery, who has been spotted in the chapel Undercroft, next to what is believed to have been his coffin. The drummer boy is less well known and is said to have been killed in the castle grounds by a single musket bullet. And he can still be heard banging his drum at night. He is also considered to be a bad luck omen. So what do you think? Have Ryan and Natalie actually captured a ghost on camera? We'd all love to hear your thoughts. Gary Gilmore. On July 19, 1976, career criminal Gary Gilmore robbed a gas station attendant, Max Jensen, at gunpoint in Orem, Utah. And despite Jensen complying with his demands, Gary shot him in the head twice and killed him. The next day, Gilmore robbed motel manager Ben Bushnell, who he also shot and killed. Shortly after the deaths, Gary was arrested after his cousin notified the police, and he was charged with murder. He later confessed to both killings, but was only convicted of killing Bushnell due to lack of evidence. Gary was sentenced to death for the crime, and he opted to be shot by firing squad. He refused to appeal his death sentence, and even fired his attorney, who tried to get the sentence overturned. When his mother tried to stop the execution, he wrote to the local newspaper asking her to stop any appeals. Despite being a very intelligent, artistic man with an IQ of 133, Gary spent most of his adult life in and out of prison. He had a chaotic upbringing and a troubled relationship with his alcoholic father, Frank. But was that the reason he turned to crime, or was his life already mapped out for him before he was born by his mother, and her terrifying experience with an Ouija board? Gary's mother, Bessie, was a somewhat unstable character and was convinced her husband, Frank, was the illegitimate son of Houdini. Bessie also believed that all the problems her and her family had encountered throughout their life was the result of a demonic spirit that had attached itself to her when she messed with an Ouija board as a child. This belief was exacerbated when one of her sisters was killed and another one left paralyzed after an accident. When Bessie married Frank and the couple had children, they lived with Frank's mother, Faye, who was a medium. One evening, after Faye had performed a séance, she was particularly fatigued, and Bessie helped her to bed before going to bed herself. Later that night, Bessie woke up to a feeling of being touched and saw a demon face leering at her in the darkness. Shocked by what she saw, she called out to Faye, who started staggering towards her, telling her to get out and shouting, "It knows who you are." Bessie rushed through the house to rescue her 4 children and discovered the same demon standing over her son Gary, looking at him directly in his eyes. After the incident, Gary began to have terrible nightmares, and when he started getting in trouble at the age of 14, Bessie was convinced that that night the demon she had summoned as a child had possessed her son, turning him into an angry and violent man, to which he became. When Gary was executed by firing squad in 1977, Bessie was quoted as saying that the one who committed the crime was not her son, but was the demon that dwelt inside him. In an interesting side note, Gary's last words before his execution were, "Let's do it," which earned him fame when advertising executive Dan Whedon credited his parting words as the inspiration for Nike's tagline. He is also the subject of Norman Mailer's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Executioner's Song, which was adapted into a movie starring Tommy Lee Jones. The Durham Dog Murder. On Christmas Eve of 2014, Paul Carroll from County Durham in the UK used an Ouija board to try and contact the dead, but instead he believed he summoned an evil spirit that possessed his dog Molly. So in an act of complete insanity, he drowned poor Molly in a bath full of water. Paul later tried to bury her body near the Hat and Feather Inn near Consett, but after fearing he would be disturbed, he cut her up and put the bits down the drain at the back of his house. Several days later, the drain became blocked and began to overflow, and emergency drainage men were called to unblock the drain, but they were unaware of the horror that had caused the blockage. However, a neighbour alerted the police after she went round to Paul's house and noticed the dog was missing. When she asked where it was, initially Paul told her it had been rehomed, before later admitting he had killed the dog. When the police arrived on January 10th, Paul told officers the dog had been possessed by an evil spirit, following a séance with an Ouija board. After the confession, the police moved quickly to remove 3 other dogs and a snake from the property. In court, Paul admitted he had killed Molly and was given an 18-week sentence, a supervised order, fined £165, and banned from keeping animals for 10 years. However, that was not the end of the story. Just 1 week after Paul's guilty plea, his wife Margaret and her daughter Katrina used the same Ouija board. This time the board told them they were going to die. The following day, both mother and daughter took an overdose of prescription drugs and set the house on fire. Thankfully, they both survived the fire, but were jailed for 4 years each for arson. Despite their claims, the Ouija board made them do it. The Ouija board made me do it. In 2012, 3 teenage friends from Weslaco, Texas, were playing with an Ouija board in a wooded area near a local high school. At some point, for no apparent reason, one of the boys turned to one of his friends and stabbed him in the stomach with a 4-inch blade. Then, in a moment of realization and possibly remorse, he picked his injured friend up and carried him to a nearby auto shop to seek help, and a witness claimed he was urging the victim to pretend that he had fallen on the knife. The injured boy luckily survived the near-fatal wound that caused intestinal laceration and a 3-day stay in intensive care. Officers arrived at the scene quickly and arrested the unnamed boy. And when police asked him why he stabbed his longtime friend, he said the Ouija board made me. At the time, police spokesman J.P. Rodriguez said he actually believed what the Ouija board advised him. The boy was arrested and charged with attempted murder. At his trial, the boy tried to plead insanity, but it emerged that he had no history of mental illness, although he did believe that the board allegedly told him that his friend was the cause of all his problems, and that he should kill him. However, the fact that the boy realized what he had done and was lucid enough to seek help and urge his friends to cover up his crime suggested he was perfectly sane when he stabbed his friend. It was a bizarre case, and eventually the boy was sentenced to 3 years at a Texas juvenile justice facility, and it's very likely he is now free. Clottie Marchand. This next case proves that an Ouija board is not a modern phenomenon. On March 6, 1930, Clottie Marchand, a French artist, was found dead at the foot of the stairs in her Buffalo, New York home by her young son. It quickly became apparent she hadn't fallen, but had been beaten to death. Clottie was married to Henry Marchand, a French artist and renowned sculptor who studied under Auguste Rodin and was a specialist in dioramas and precision wax modeling. The couple had emigrated to the US in the 1920s with their children. Throughout their marriage, Henry had been a serial philanderer who had many affairs. Soon after the murder, suspicion initially fell on Henry, but after interviewing him, it became apparent that a young Seneca woman named Lilla Jimison was a more likely suspect. Jimison was one of Henry's models, whom he was having an affair with. Jimison was arrested, and after questioning, she named an older Seneca woman called Nancy Bowen. Further questioning revealed that Lilla had convinced Bowen that Mrs. Marchand was a white witch who used her powers to kill Bowen's recently deceased husband Charlie. The conclusion was apparently made by the two women when they played on a Ouija board to find an explanation for Charlie's death. Allegedly, the board revealed a message from Charlie spelling out "they killed me." When the women asked the board who did it, the board spelled out Clottie. It also revealed her address. Soon after the seance, Nancy started receiving letters signed Mrs. Dooley that claimed Clottie Marchand was a witch who had hexed Charlie out of jealousy. But when that didn't work, she decided to kill him. Nancy, who was a vulnerable woman, became convinced that Clottie had killed her husband and she would be next. On the day of the murder, Bowen went to the Marchands' home and knocked on the door. When Clottie had opened it, Nancy accused her of being a witch and pulled out a hammer, then mercilessly beat her before finishing her off by stuffing a chloroform-soaked paper down her throat. Both Nancy and Lilla were charged with murder, but remarkably, Lilla was acquitted after she claimed she was not party to the murder and implicated Henry, saying he was bored of his wife. Nancy was also released after pleading guilty to manslaughter and accepting a sentence of time served. By this time, Henry had moved to Albany and married his dead wife's 18-year-old niece. He was never prosecuted and died in 1951. Lilla Jimison married a local man and lived a long life in Perrysburg, near her old reservation. She died in 1972. As for poor Clottie, she was buried in Section 40 in Forest Lawn Cemetery in Buffalo, New York, in an unmarked grave. The boys who asked the Ouija board the wrong questions. In 2007, teenage boys Joshua Tucker and Donald Schulchlin were messing with an Ouija board and asked if they should become serial. They should kill first. Mom. Close friend Joshua and Donald had been out Christmas shopping looking for a gift for Donald's mother, but when they failed to find anything suitable, Joshua suggested they purchase an Ouija board. After the purchase, Joshua's behavior changed drastically, and he told Donald that he had fantasized about raping and killing people. And after a heavy drinking session, the boys asked the Ouija board the question about becoming serial killers. Donald believed that during that session, Joshua had called forth the spirit of Satan and had become possessed. On December 20th, 2007, West Richland, Washington police received a 911 hang-up call from the Schulchlins' home. When they arrived at the house, they found 15-year-old Donald and 16-year-old Joshua attempting to flee in a white truck. After apprehending the two boys, police entered the house and were confronted with a bloodbath. Just inside the front door lay the body of Donald's younger sister, 13-year-old Elizabeth. Joshua had sliced her throat while she was talking on the phone. In the back bedroom, they found Donald's mother, Laurie. According to reports, Laurie had walked in as the boys attempted to clean up after murdering Elizabeth, and Joshua chased her, then stabbed her several times. When the knife broke, Donald handed Joshua a dumbbell and a meat cleaver to finish the job. Laurie was still alive when police found her, but later succumbed to her injuries en route to the hospital. Joshua pleaded guilty to the murders and was ordered to spend the next 40 years behind bars. Donald, who prosecutors determined had been an accomplice to the crime but had not committed the murders himself, was offered a plea deal. In exchange for a guilty plea, he was sentenced to only 9.5 years, in spite of protests from his surviving family members. In the official court documents, Donald's claims of demonic possession were cited in the case, although these claims were never presented to a jury. Black eyes, no body. It all started when Ryan was around 5 years old, and he used to live in a village called Heswall in northwest UK. He was staying at his nan's house, which was only up the road from his home, but was particularly creepy, especially at night, as she lived on a dark lane with woods opposite. The house was quite old, and when his nan brought it back in the late 1950s, it still had a massive crack where a hole was patched up, after damage from a bomb during World War II. Ryan had stayed overnight at the house several times, but this particular night, he woke up in the early hours and went to the toilet. As he walked back to his room, he heard a noise from the bottom of the stairs. He curiously turned around and looked down the stairs. At first he saw something white, but then whatever it was came into full view, and it had a bright white face, a mouth, and the blackest eyes he'd ever seen, but strangely it had no body. Ryan was terrified and ran into his nan's room and hid under the covers. His nan asked what was wrong, and Ryan told her he had heard a noise. His nan went downstairs to investigate and came back and said it must have been something outside and it was nothing to worry about. After that night, Ryan refused to go upstairs in his nan's house alone, as he always felt like he was being watched. This manifested into him being petrified of looking up or down any stairs, and he often had someone with him just to attempt walking up or down them. As Ryan got older, he would sometimes be sitting on a bus or in school and would feel a hand press on his back, and he'd often find long random scratches appear on his body. The occurrences and fear of stairs lasted until he was around 13 years old, but at night he still felt uncomfortable with the feeling of being watched. Sadly, in 2009, Ryan's nan passed away from cancer at the age of 67, leaving Ryan and his family devastated. And in 2012, he and his family moved into his nan's old house. They lived there for 5 years, during which time Ryan never once looked down the stairs at night, for fear of seeing the face again. Ryan is now 23, and still has nightmares about the face, and as recently as 2 years ago, he would still get bright red scratches appear from nowhere on his arms. However, when he got married, and he and his wife had a baby daughter, the scratches stopped, and he now just has the occasional nightmare. although he is still petrified of wide open spaces and crowds when he is alone, as he gets the feeling he is being watched and hunted down. To this day, the face Ryan saw as a 5-year-old is vivid in his mind, and is the scariest thing he's ever seen, and those black as black eyes are still etched into his memory. Apart from his wife, Ryan hasn't shared this experience with anyone, as he found it so difficult to relive and thought people would think he was crazy, but assures us it was very real and would love to know if any of you have experienced anything similar. Strange anomaly on Ring camera. Deborah sent in this next footage. It is from her Ring camera that she had installed about a year ago. We do get sent quite a lot of Ring camera footage, mostly of orbs that are likely insects or cobwebs. But this footage is a little different. It doesn't appear to be your typical movement of flying bugs. Deborah has shown the footage to several people, and they have no plausible explanation for what was caught. Take a look. Pretty strange. Deborah is not aware that anyone died in the house before she moved in, or whether they experienced any strange anomalies, as she's never experienced anything inside the house. Deborah is a skeptic when it comes to anything paranormal, but is a little creeped out by what the camera has caught outside of her home. You will notice in the video a shooting star and a bat, but what the other floating mist is, we aren't sure. If any of you have any suggestions, let us know in the comments, as I'm sure Deborah will sleep easier if she has some answers. Who was Abby? This next photo was sent in by Stacy. It was taken about 20 years ago when her nephew was a baby. As soon as he could speak, he would talk about Abby, and one of his first words after Mama was Abby. No one in the family was called Abby, neither did they have any friends called Abby. As he grew up, he continually talked about his imaginary friend, and it wasn't uncommon to find him sitting on the floor laughing, talking, and playing with someone that wasn't there. He continued talking to Abby until he was around 8 years old, when he suddenly stopped mentioning her. When this photo was taken, a strange mist was visible above the baby. The family were puzzled, as there wasn't anyone smoking in the room. The temperature in the house was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was no other reason for the mist to appear. They wonder if Abby had anything to do with it. Paranormal investigators are convinced that a swirling fog or ectomist is a sign of a spirit. They are mostly captured in graveyards and can be white, grey, or even black, and sometimes they appear before becoming a full-bodied apparition. Is this what was captured in the baby's photo? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Unexplained Events. Stacy has 2 stories she wants to share. The first was in the house she grew up, that she believes is haunted. The house is the oldest standing brick house in a very small town and dates back to the 1840s, and the interior walls of the original structure are at least a foot thick. It wasn't only Stacy who experienced paranormal activity in the house, her brothers and cousins also did. They are all middle-aged adults now and rarely talk about the strange things that happened in the house, for fear that whatever was there will find them again. In fact, there were so many strange things that happened to Stacy and her family that she might eventually write a book about them. Stacy was very close to her great-grandmother until she had a stroke when Stacy was 14. After that, she was never the same, and when Stacy visited her in the care home, she had to be mentally prepared for her great-grandmother to think she was one of her long-dead cousins, and to pretend not to be creeped out when she talked to little children only she could see. One night, Stacy awoke to see her great-grandma standing in the doorway of her bedroom. She was very shocked and remembered saying, "Grandma, when did you get here?" Her grandma replied, "I am going now," and Stacy remembers saying, "Okay, have a good trip," and went back to sleep. At the time, she recalls feeling confused but comforted, as her grandma looked like her old self, not the emaciated shell she'd become since her stroke. The next day, Stacy asked her parents about the visit, assuming they had brought her home, but they kind of mocked her because it was so ridiculous. There was no way her great-grandmother could visit, as she was too ill. Stacy was confused, as she felt there was very much a man standing behind her great-grandmother, and had assumed it was her dad helping her up the stairs. Later that day, Stacy found out that her grandmother had died the very night she had seen her. So was it all just a very vivid dream, or had her great-grandmother come to say goodbye? Stacy's next experience happened almost 25 years later, not in the same house, but this time at her parents' old farmhouse, that was located so far in the country you couldn't even see neighbours. At the time, Stacy's dad and her brother were living there alone, and Stacy and her mum were visiting. Just as they were getting ready to leave at around 4 p.m. in the afternoon, they both headed to the bathroom, because it was almost an hour drive back with nowhere to stop. Stacy came out to the bathroom and joined her mum in the entryway, by the base of the stairs, when they heard as clear as day the unmistakable sound of a little girl giggling. They looked at each other in shock, and asked each other whether they heard it. Then both rushed out in a state of bewilderment. Stacy cannot explain what happened, but it felt like a little girl, maybe 6 years old, ran between her and her mum, and was giggling as she ran up the stairs. The whole thing lasted around 6 seconds, but both Stacy and her mum got the feeling the little girl was pleased with herself for frightening them, as if she was playing a prank. It could not have been a living person, as they were the only two in the house, as the rest of the family were outside. Stacy cannot explain or dismiss what has happened to her over the years, but has her own thoughts. She likes to think of them as echoes, like when you turn off an old TV and an image remains on the screen, and that we are all powered by electrical impulses and energy that can neither be created or destroyed, only converted to other forms. Stacy is sure we will have the answers in the future, and the idea of her energy being converted and carried on comforts her. Stacy doesn't know how or why these things happened. All she knows is they did. Haunted London Bridge in Arizona. Back in 2007, Darren moved to Lake Havasu City, Arizona, and was surprised to find that one of its main attractions was the London Bridge. The bridge was originally built in 1830 and spanned the River Thames in London, England. However, by the 1960s, London was outgrowing the bridge, and it was decided a new London Bridge was needed. So in 1968, they sold the old one to Robert P. McCulloch, the founder of Lake Havasu City in Arizona. Robert dismantled the bridge and transported the exterior granite blocks to the United States for use in the construction of a new bridge. In Lake Havasu City, it took a few years to complete, but the bridge was rebuilt exactly as it was in London, and almost everything on the bridge is original, including the bricks, streetlights, railings, and name. However, along with the bricks and mortar, many believe the bridge brought with it the centuries of violence and death attracted to the streets of London, and it's thought to be haunted by several ghosts from London's gruesome past. The paranormal activity first started during its grand opening in 1971, when some onlookers witnessed a group of 4 women in Victorian dress walking along the bridge. Most thought it was a publicity stunt done by the city until the women mysteriously vanished into thin air. Another common occurrence on the bridge is apparitions wearing period clothing who disappear when you get too close. The most common sighting is the ghost of a woman in a black dress. She is usually seen walking quickly across the bridge, clutching her purse, and some have seen her jumping into the water at night, but disappear right before impact. Many have also felt a force of dark energy following them while crossing the bridge, or have heard unknown voices in their ear. It has such a reputation that numerous creepy films and TV shows have been filmed there, including the psychological thriller Olivia, the supernatural crime drama Bridge Across Time, about the murderous spirit of Jack the Ripper, and Ghost Adventures have done an episode there. With all that in mind, Darren, his ex-girlfriend, and another friend, who were really into ghost hunting at the time, decided to go to the bridge one night and take photos and voice recordings. When they listened back to one of the recordings, they were shocked to hear a whispering voice they didn't recognize. In the clip, you can hear Darren's girlfriend telling her friend where to take pictures and things to look for, while Darren was holding the voice recorder. You can also hear cars driving by, but listen carefully, there is another voice that didn't belong to any of them.
Try to get pictures of these down here. Try to get as many windows as you can. And more space where people could be walking or hiding or sitting. You can also take pictures of your fellow ghost hunters at work to show that we are actually trying. You know? Anyway.
We have to agree, if that wasn't any of the three present, and Darren assures us it wasn't, then it's pretty creepy, especially with the history attached to the bridge. Darren thinks he can hear. How many times do I have to tell you? What can you hear? Time slip. This first creepy encounter was sent in by Logan from New York. In 2010, Logan worked at a nursing home in Somers, New York, that had a reputation for being a bit creepy, although until this incident, Logan had not personally experienced anything. However, that was all about to change. Logan checked in for a Thursday overnight shift. The procedure as a nurse's aide was to check allocated patients every 15 minutes. So Logan first checked in on a lady, who was, for the sake of this story, called Miss Johnson. He entered her room and everything was as it should be. Her usual posters and family pictures were all on the walls, and her usual medication was on the bedside table. Miss Johnson was laying on her back, sleeping, so Logan didn't disturb her. Nearing the end of his shift, Logan checked in on Miss Johnson for the last time, and was a little concerned as she was in the exact same position as before. So he alerted a nurse and asked her to take a look. The nurse stopped doing what she was doing and took off her glasses. She went quiet for a couple of minutes before saying, "Logan, Miss Johnson died last night." Slightly embarrassed, Logan went back to Miss Johnson's room to check and found it cleared out and cleaned, ready for the next patient. To this day, the thought of what happened scares Logan. He was close enough to Miss Johnson to be able to touch her face, but she wasn't even there. She had been moved after passing 24 hours earlier. Loch Lomond Catman. This story has been shared by one of our long-time subscribers who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll call them D. D never thought they would be the sort of person who would send in a personal story, but after one of the most unnerving experiences in their life, felt compelled to contact us to see if our viewers could shed some light on what happened. D had just moved to Glasgow to complete their PhD, and a friend was visiting from Canada. Because D was new to the area, they thought it would be fun to check out the famous Highlands of Scotland. The pair took the train from Glasgow to Balloch, hoping to then jump on a local bus that would take them to Loch Lomond. When a bus for the village of Balmanor arrived, they hopped on and headed off. On the bus, Dee began feeling extremely nauseous, but dismissed it as a bit of travel sickness, as the roads were windy. As soon as they reached Balmaha, they went to the Oak Tree Inn where Dee vomited. After feeling a little better, the pair sat in the beer garden and ordered some food. As they sat waiting, a waitress came out with a single malt whiskey and started looking for the person who ordered it, stopping at each table to check whether someone with the surname Catman had ordered the drink, but strangely no one claimed it. With such a weird name, Dee and their friend laughed about Catman being a local urban legend, and that someone had ordered the drink under a fake name just to be spooky. After they'd eaten, they went on a hike through the dense forests on the foothills of Loch Lomond. This area is usually very busy with families, hikers and dog walkers, and as they headed up the trail, they met several people coming in the opposite direction with their dogs. However, all the dogs they encountered seemed agitated and nervous, and wouldn't stop barking. This in turn was unsettling their owners. There was also a man walking a bit behind with a German Shepherd-like dog. He appeared to be getting increasingly frustrated as his dog was refusing to move, and he was basically dragging it along. In the end, he gave up and turned around, leaving Dee and their friend alone on the trail. Although slightly unnerved that the once busy area was now quiet, the two kept walking up the foothills. The brush was really dense, and while there was the usual rustling and chirping of the forest sounds, there was also a weird, unsettling noise that sounded like sniggering or hissing. However, it didn't sound human. The pair were pretty freaked out by this stage, but kept walking to try and find a good lookout spot to see the loch. Suddenly Dee's friend pointed into the dense woods, and for a split second, they both saw a hunched-over man wearing a stovepipe hat. All of a sudden, the figure turned around and stared right at them, His hands were extremely hairy, and he held them in front of his chest like claws. His face was bewhiskered. Quickly, Dee's friend turned on their phone light, and when the light hit the man's eyes, they glowed like a cat's. Terrified, the two friends ran, and for the rest of the day, all they could think and talk about was how scared they both were, and whether what they witnessed was anything to do with the catman who ordered the drink earlier. Dee asked us to do some research on the area to see if anyone has experienced anything similar. The nearest we could find was the Catman of Greenock, a town about 35 miles from Loch Lomond. Legend says that the Catman of Greenock is a man with dark skin who is usually spotted at night, hiding in bushes and under vehicles. He supposedly has glowing eyes and eats rats with his bare hands. He is thought to be a Russian sailor who abandoned his ship in the 1970s and started living on the streets of Greenock. He earned the name Catman due to rumours that he lived with a group of wild cats and started mimicking their behaviours. Could it be that Dee's sighting and the Catman of Greenock are one and the same? What do you think? Deceased uncle making contact. Paul lives in New Zealand now, but grew up in Edinburgh, Scotland. When he was 16, Paul lived with his family in a 2-bedroom flat in Edinburgh. Because the house was so small, Paul shared a bedroom with his uncle. However, sadly, his uncle had a massive heart attack and died in the home. Almost immediately after his death, Paul started hearing what sounded like someone walking around his room at night, and things started moving around the house. Paul's parents were pretty dismissive at first, putting it down to grief and an overactive teenage imagination. Paul often had friends over and told them how his bedroom door would open by itself, and on a few occasions, his friends also witnessed it. Paul's mum also started to have strange things happen that couldn't be easily explained, and when his sister came to stay, just after having a baby, during the night when getting up to feed the baby, she'd hear footsteps walking down the hall. She'd look, expecting to see her mum or brother, but no one was there, they were all asleep. On another occasion, a few years after his uncle's death, Paul was in the house on his own and was laying in the bath when there were 3 loud knocks on the bathroom door. By now, Paul had got used to the strange anomalies and was no longer freaked out by them because he felt it was just his uncle contacting him from the afterlife to let him know that he was still around. We know this is quite a common thing after someone close has passed, and we'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. The Men in Black. Amber is one of our valued patrons, and she sent this story in about her mum. It's only short, but extremely creepy. When Amber's mum was a child, she regularly had visions of 4 men dressed in suits and black hats, all walking up the stairs together at her mum and dad's house. She was terrified of them, and always too scared to be left alone. When Amber was about 10, her mum's parents and now Amber's nan and granddad still lived in the same house. But in around 2006, her granddad became seriously ill with cancer, and the family took care of him in the house during his last days. After he passed away, the family called the undertakers, and when they arrived, Amber's mum showed them up the stairs to where her dad was. As she neared the top, she saw the 4 men from her childhood, dressed in suits and all wearing black hats. Premonitions like this are incredibly common and creepy, and we'd love to know if you've ever had any similar premonitions to Amber's. Landline from the other side. Isaiah shared this next story with us from the early days of his 911 telecommunications career. Isaiah's first apartment kept 911 and dispatch operations in the basement of the sheriff's office, which later had a jail added. The building itself was very old and had a few ghost stories of its own, but the story he remembers most vividly is this one. Isaiah was working overnight with an older co-worker. She was due to leave at midnight, and he would be staying alone until 8 AM to monitor officers and any emergencies. Around 11 PM, a call came in on the 911 line. Isaiah's co-worker picked it up and afterwards relayed the call to him. She told him that after asking the usual questions about the address and nature of the emergency, the female caller went silent, but after a long pause said in a quiet voice, "Hello." The co-worker then asked if she was okay. Was there an emergency? The woman hesitated again before replying, "Yes, I think there is." She was then asked, "Can you tell me what's happening? Do you need an ambulance?" There was another silence before the caller spoke again in a confused voice. Yes, I think I do. The co-worker continues to ask what's wrong, but the lady doesn't answer again. So assuming the caller may have fainted or passed out, the co-worker sends an ambulance to the location. Luckily, because the call was from a landline, the address was automatically assigned. The 911 terminal showed it as a local nursing home, and the specific landline was assigned to a particular room number. Initially, a police officer is sent out to assess the situation. However, about 15 minutes later, the officer calls in on the radio and advises Isaiah to cancel the ambulance. It is not needed. Isaiah and his co-worker are confused, but do as he asks. A few moments later, the officer called in again on the landline. Isaiah picks up the call, and the first thing the officer says is that if we receive another call from that room, to send his sergeant, as he will not be going back. It is worth noting, it is extremely unusual for any officer to refuse to attend a call. When Isaiah asked what happened, he said he spoke with the charge nurse at the nursing home, and she informed him the female resident in that specific room had passed away the day before, and no one had been in to clean it out, and no one had access to that landline during the night. When Isaiah relayed the information to the colleague who took the initial call, she was freaked out to say the least. The following day, Isaiah listened to the call himself. He remembered the crackle of static on the line, unusual for landlines, and the way the woman spoke, almost confused, like she knew something was wrong, but she couldn't really pin down what it was. But most of all, there was the look on his co-worker's face. She knew she spoke with someone in that room. The woman on the line was real, but the officer was telling us she wasn't. In fact, she might even have been dead. Isaiah has never forgotten that shift and his co-worker's fear at her brush with the unknown. Hand of Horror. The last story we'll talk about was sent in by a viewer who wishes to remain anonymous, so we'll call her A. A's story happened when she was 9 or 10 years old while visiting a relative in Middleburg, Florida, near the Jacksonville area. A was asleep in bed when she suddenly woke in the middle of the night. She wasn't sure if the noises woke her up, or if they started shortly after she woke up, but she could hear something heavily shuffling across the carpet. The door to the master bedroom was open, and she could just see across the hall to where her adult relatives were asleep and completely still. A's 2 brothers were also asleep in their rooms. The noise lasted what felt like forever, but A continued laying in her bed until it got so loud she pulled the covers over her head and eventually it stopped. After a few minutes, A mustered up the courage to look from under the sheets, and to her horror, she could see across the hall that something was attached to the lower leg of her sleeping relative. It looked like a large black hairy hand with long pointy sharp nails. It appeared as if someone or something was crouched next to the foot of the bed, and the hand was coming from the floor. It's worth noting that A has told us that she has lucid dreams, sleep paralysis, and even night terrors on rare occasions, but this was not one of these times. She was fully aware she was awake, could move, but had no control over what she was witnessing. The next morning, A talked about the incident with the relative, who dismissed it as just a dream, or that she had just heard him rubbing his foot against the sheets. But A knew what she saw and heard, and it wasn't that. A has never been able to explain what happened that night, but one thing she is sure of is it did happen. After the incident, A did a bit of research, and the closest thing she could get was a skunk ape, although there was no foul stench, so doesn't believe it was that. If any of you have experienced anything similar, I'm sure A would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Grey Lady of Cumber Park. Cumber Park in Nottinghamshire has long had the reputation of being haunted by a grey lady who walks slowly and disappears into the mist as strangers approach. The National Trust-owned park is very popular with dog walkers, and when Hannah and Dave Rowett were walking their Labradors in the park early one morning, in December 2022, they got the feeling they were not alone. Hannah spotted something in front of her, quickly pulled out her phone, and captured a scary white silhouette crossing her path as she followed it with a torch. Take a look. After Hannah posted it to her Facebook page, it racked up hundreds of views and comments. Hannah claimed there was no logical explanation for what she captured, and even her skeptic partner Dave was stunned. Could that have been the Grey Lady that supposedly haunts the woodland, or is there another explanation? Let us know below. Chop Chop House in Boise, Idaho. 805 West Linden Street in Boise, Idaho is known to locals as Chop Chop House for a very good reason. The craftsman-style home was the location of a gruesome murder more than 3 decades ago. In the early morning hours of June 30th, 1987, 37-year-old and drunk got killed in the basement of the Boise house that at the time was owned by Rogers. The two men then used an axe and knife to dismember Mer's corpse. They then wrapped the body parts in plastic bags and drove to the Idaho-Oregon border to dump them in the Brownlee Reservoir. However, it seems that Mer's horrifying death could have been avoided. Investigations revealed that after an altercation broke out between the 3 men, Mer was shot in the shoulder, but he managed to flee the scene and ran to a nearby house, frantically banging on the door begging for help. The person inside didn't answer the door, but they did call the police and told them about the pounding on the door, and that they could hear someone shouting, "Let go of me," followed by anguished screams. The police never responded to the call. The following day, the neighbor called again after finding blood on his screen door. When police finally arrived, they found blood throughout the neighborhood, on sidewalks, and at least one other neighboring house, as Paul Mers desperately tried to seek help and escape his attackers. Rogers and Cox were eventually jailed for their parts in the slaying, but since that night, a dark legacy lingers around 805 W Linden Street. Today the house is rented out to students seeking off-campus housing, but rumours persist about what goes on in the house that many describe as having a distinctly off feel about it. One persistent rumour is that blood has been witnessed dripping down the walls of the basement. The basement is where all the paranormal activity is felt, with stories of being watched, and a general unsettling feeling. But perhaps the creepiest experience happened to student Dan and his friends, who had rented the house. One night they thought they'd heard someone trying to break into the house. No one was there when they went to the front porch to check things out, but after looking around the front yard, Dan turned to face the house and saw a big black oily looking thing in the window of an upstairs bedroom. He remembers the shadowy figure moving back from the window and towards the bedroom door before it disappeared. Shortly after, it reappeared outside in a mirror on the porch. Dan watched as the ball of oily blackness moved down the large column of the porch, slowly growing in size until it took up the full reflection of the mirror and moved right through him. The vivid and unsettling experience has given the house such a bad reputation that many avoid it, believing the oily blob is the desperate spirit of Preston Mer, still trying to escape his assailants. Last sight of a departed friend. This next true paranormal experience happened to Margaret S. Gladstone from Wiltshire, England, who wrote to Country Life magazine on September 24th, 1948. Margaret was prompted to write by some recent letters which had appeared in the magazine in previous weeks. Margaret recalled returning to her flat in Westminster, London, one afternoon when she saw 2 friends coming towards her on the other side of the street. She was in a rush and running late, and although they were dear friends, she had no time to stop and hoped they would not notice her. Margaret deliberately crossed the street, walking behind them, and successfully avoided their gaze. At breakfast time the next day, a mutual friend rang to tell Margaret that the man she had seen the day before had passed away in the night. Margaret was shocked and told the friend that she had seen him and his wife the day before, and they appeared in full health. Her friend then exclaimed that this was an impossibility, as he had been ill for some days and had been bedbound. So was he trying to say a last goodbye, or was it a case of mistaken identity? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever experienced something like this. Lizzie Borden House. Most people know the story of Lizzie Borden, the daughter who on August 4th, 1893, allegedly brutally murdered both her parents in their home in Fall Rivers, Massachusetts. Andrew and his wife Abby Borden were found slaughtered in their home. Although murder wasn't uncommon in the late 1800s, The severity of their injuries inflicted by an axe shocked the locals, and soon their 32-year-old daughter Lizzie became the main suspect. The crime and trial made headlines around the world. However, Lizzie was eventually acquitted of murder, but she remains forever linked to the heinous killings, as does the home where they were committed. Nowadays, the house is a bed and breakfast and attracts visitors from around the world who are drawn by morbid curiosity and want to see for themselves if the place lives up to its reputation of being haunted. One of the tour guides at the house tells how when she started working there, she was skeptic and didn't believe in the paranormal. That was until she started experiencing a few strange things herself. Guests had long reported that they could hear laughing and playing in the middle of the night and things moving around. The guide didn't believe them until she found toys scattered around a room no one had been in and witnessed a picture fall over and slide in front of her without a plausible explanation, and a closet door open on its own. Also, on the eve of the anniversary of Andrew and Abby's murder, she and 2 other tour guides felt sudden sharp piercing pains in their left eye, in the exact location of Andrew Borden's fatal injuries. But perhaps the creepiest thing of all happened when the guide asked a tour group to turn their cell phones to silent before starting a tour. Moments later, a guest's cell phone started ringing. The female guest looked up and said, "It's my mum." The tour guide asked if she wanted to leave and take the call, to which the woman replied, "She died 2 years ago." Who's that girl? In 2022, brothers Christian and Gabriel Ashmore took a selfie of themselves inside a tower of tires. However, after looking more closely at one of the images, they realized they were not alone in the stack, because looking over their shoulder was the ghostly image of a young girl they didn't recognize. Christian told his mum and showed her the photo, and initially she thought the boys had messed with the image, using some kind of ghost app, so she did a couple of checks to see if she could change the lighting, or see whether the photo had been altered in any way, but couldn't find any evidence of this, and believed her boys didn't have the skills to change the photo anyway, and they were adamant they had not edited it in any way. In fact, Christian was apparently left so terrified by the ghost girl that he refused to go to bed alone and stayed in his mum's room. After sharing the photo with family and friends on Facebook, many believed the boys had captured the spirit of a deceased child who just wanted to play, whilst others were more skeptical, believing the photo is tampered with. What do you think? When the ghost you're hunting hunts you. The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, is best known as the location of the Shawshank Redemption movie. However, it also boasts a rather unpleasant history. It was originally built in 1896 for boys who were too old for juvenile detention but hadn't committed crimes warranting prison. Although eventually it was converted into a maximum security prison. By the 1980s, conditions had become wretched, and it was a horrible place with a vein of violence that ran right through the building. It was the scene of several suicides, murders and riots, and eventually it was closed in 1990. With its history of misery and death, it is no surprise that the building is haunted not only by former inmates and employees, but by anyone associated with them, including women. One is the tormented soul of the wife of a former warden who was shot with a gun sitting on top of a box that she was pulling down from a closet shelf. The anguished woman is often heard crying, and her rose-smelling perfume wafts in one of the bedrooms. Another spirit is a woman who sits in the prison chapel and cries, but when she is approached, she disappears. Other people have witnessed her walking around the chapel. Then there's the malevolent presence in one of the prison's solitary confinement cells, an angry spirit who wards off ghost hunters and visitors, warning them not to enter his cell. He has been caught on tape swearing. The former prisoner has also been known to follow people home, and one ghost hunter and her partner had a terrifying experience when he latched on to one of them. One day, one of them saw him through a reflection in the window, a shadow figure she knew was him. In fact, the spirit continued to follow her until things got so bad, an expert had to be called in to rid her of the ghost. A scary tale of when ghost hunting can go wrong, and the reality of what happens when you go looking for the wrong things. So that's it for this video. We hope you enjoyed, and we'd love to hear your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. We'd also love to hear if you've had any of your own stories or experiences with the paranormal lately. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next video.
Well, we got through it, ladies. We got through it. I was thoroughly engrossed in that one and the first one, to be honest. So, yeah, we got through it. So I hope you enjoyed it because I did. You know what I mean? Bye.